Welcome to the Enterprise Excellence Podcast, where our purpose is to help create a better future. Learn from our world's experts how to improve your organisation sustainably. Learn how to achieve and sustain an excellence journey for yourself, others, and the planet.
And I'm your host, Brad Jevons, coming to you from Brisbane, Australia. We are proudly brought to you in association with SA Partners, a world-leading business transformation consultancy. SA Partners are a truly purposeful company focused on helping organisations achieve sustainable improvement for themselves, others, and the planet.
Welcome to episode 152 of the Enterprise Excellence Podcast. It is such a pleasure to have Mr Mark Graban back on the show with us today. Mark was with us originally way back in episode 20. Mark is a host of a number of leading podcasts in the lean and continuous improvement world. Lean blog, interviews, my favourite mistakes, lean whiskey with Jamie Flinchbaugh, and more. He is an author of many books, including Lean Hospitals, Practising Lean, Measures of Success, and his latest books, The Mistakes That Make Uus, Cultivating a Culture of Learning and Innovation. Let's get into the episode. Mark, thanks so much for joining us again, mate.
Brad, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, appreciate it. Now, mate, I know from reading the book, there's an interesting backstory to what led you down this path of working on mistakes and then writing a book about your favourite mistakes. Mate, do you mind explaining that journey and why you chose to go down this path?
Well, in a way, that journey started maybe about 8 years ago. I kicked off a book project I titled Practising Lean. I have a copy of it there. And, part of the inspiration for practicing lean came from some reflection on my part of, I was at that point of like 20 years into my career. And, sometimes you feel like you hit this point where, like, I wasn't saying I felt like I knew it all, but you feel like you know enough to feel confident about, disagreeing with people and, seeing things online, whether it's, in the context of Lean Six Sigma. Some of those posts may have upset or triggered me and maybe prompted replies that weren't abusive, but maybe in this gray area of I felt like I was correct, but maybe I was coming across in a way that wasn't really going to change anyone's mind. It was going to maybe make people defensive. Like I was arguing as opposed to coaching. And sometimes you see news articles. I remember one about a company that was implementing 5S in the office, and they told people, you can't put a sweater on the back of your chair, and you can't have family photos on your desk. And I would go on a rant, and I would write, a blog post that, maybe would come across as self-righteous, because people, I think, when they're new to something like lean, they may likely make mistakes. It may be a matter of enthusiasm, they mean well. Maybe they don't have the benefit of a coach or mentor to help them along the way, and they make mistakes. And sometimes you read about those mistakes. And so practicing lean, that book came to be when I wrote 2 chapters to kick off the book of sharing mistakes I made in the early days of my lean practice. And it is partly a reminder to myself to don't be too hard on people who are just starting off practicing lean, if you will. Sharing mistakes, not to shame myself for them, but just to share that reflection of making mistakes as part of the learning process. And so 15 other writers, Jamie Flinchbaugh and others, accepted my invitation to write a chapter, kind of sharing some of their early mistakes, what they learned. And I've gotten good feedback on that book. That it's a good reminder. And again, the message was directed at myself to try to react to things and to be a kind coach, not a critical coach. And then that kind of planted the seeds, I think, for what became the My Favorite Mistake podcast. I started September 2020. The quick story there was, I would get contacted by public relations firms saying, so-and-so should be a guest in your podcast. And, Brad, doing a podcast on lean, there's a certain boundaries around it that listeners might expect. And I was being proposed an opportunity to interview Kevin Harrington, who's not like everyday famous, but he was on season 1 of Shark Tank in the US. He was one of the sharks. And I thought I would love to meet him. I would love to interview him, bounce some ideas back and forth. And he accepted the opportunity to come on a new podcast called My Favorite Mistake, where he was willing to answer and share and tell a story of his favorite mistake. And that got the ball rolling. And then about a year and a half later, I thought, well, there's a lot of stories here. There's some patterns, there's some lessons learned. And that turned into the book, The Mistakes That Make Us.
Yeah, nice. And it's like, Mark, what do you find happens when, I guess, a person or an organization can start to, admit mistakes and feel safe to admit mistakes? I guess psychological safety is such a big topic right now. I'm guessing it plays right down that line. But Jim, what's your view on it, mate?
There's two levels. One is, maybe just what's going on in our own head, our own reaction to our own mistakes. I've tried to work on that, right? Of being not just kind toward others, but being kind to myself and noticing mistakes and, calling them out, like not ignoring the mistake, not discounting it, not trying to make excuses. But I think, there can be a healthy process of calling out the mistake, acknowledging it to yourself or to others, and then think about, well, what am I learning from this mistake? I'd like to not, we all make mistakes, but I'd like to try to avoid repeating a mistake. And for me, I think focusing on what do I learn? How do I act differently? How do I prevent future mistakes? To me, that helps me move past feeling bad about the mistake. But then, in a workplace, it gets a lot more complicated where by nature, I might want to admit a mistake, but I'm then thinking about, well, how are other people going to react? How is my manager going to react? Am I going to be blamed? Am I going to be punished? And this is where, it comes back to this notion of psychological safety and how do leaders create the conditions where people can choose that they decide if they feel safe. A leader can't tell you, you should feel safe here. A leader can act in certain ways that can help a person decide, I think I am safe. I can point out a mistake. I can admit a mistake and get a constructive, helpful response instead of one that's punitive. So, even Toyota, I think there's a lot of evidence of the presence of psychological safety, right? To be able to pull an andon cord and not get yelled at is, I think, a evidence of psychological safety. But, I went through some of the Toyota literature, and in the book Toyota Culture by Jeff Liker and Mike Hoseas, and Hoseas worked directly at Toyota. Liker has studied them closely for a long time. That book very specifically calls out the need at Toyota for not just physical safety, but psychological safety. And so I think it might be one of those things that the Toyota people experience and I don't know if take for granted is the right word, but if you think of the situation of like asking the goldfish to describe the water that's around them in the fishbowl, it's difficult. And some of that tacit culture at Toyota that gets called out, I think, specifically in different ways. Like we think, well, what happens when we try to bring a Kaizen system into an organization? We copy Toyota or some other organization where it's effective. We try to copy the andon cord, and then we learn, oh, people aren't using it here. Yeah. It doesn't work here. And it's probably not the fault of the employees. It's probably a matter of culture and a difference in how leaders are behaving.
Yeah. So, Mark, it's interesting you mentioned there. So a key aspect of creating that psychological safety and what someone's going to do or not do with a mistake is the reactions from potentially leaders, and I guess others, but leaders' behavior around what goes on when a mistake's made.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and leaders can, and I've learned, I've had a chance to get some formal training in the psychological safety concept and methods. One person I've learned a lot from is Timothy Clark. He's based in Utah. He's written a book called The 4 Stages of psychological safety, builds upon work that Amy Edmondson and others have done. You know, she's a great resource to person to learn from as well. But Tim Clark, I think, points out really clearly, like the two actions for leaders to cultivate psychological safety. It's first off, model the behaviors that you want to see, lead by example. So when the CEO at KaiNexus, Greg Jacobson, or a plant manager, or somebody in a leadership role admits their mistakes, again, not to shame themselves or to be ridiculed, but to focus on learning and growing and moving forward, that kind of gives permission then for others to follow their lead. And the leader might encourage their employees, well, I want you to feel safe, hopefully, to admit mistakes as well. But then the moment of truth is when somebody tries, they do admit a mistake, the leader had better, here's the second action, reward that same behavior. So leaders, modeling, leading by example, demonstrating these behaviors, and then when people follow the lead, make sure it's not just avoiding punishment, but like literally something closer to rewarding. And I don't mean pulling out your wallet and handing them cash, but reacting in a way that will encourage them to do more of that in the future.
Yeah. I remember I had Michael Jose on the podcast, and I remember him telling a story of when he was on the frontline line on I think working on doors on the cars, and he dented one against a pole in his first day, and there was some top brass Japanese leaders there, and he had that moment to think, should I pull the cord or not? And he pulled the cord, and then he thought he was going to be fired for sure. Yeah. They ended up shaking his hand. And
and I cited and quoted that story in my book, because that story was in the book Toyota Culture. They applauded him.
Yeah.
And there are two stories that were told in the My Favorite Mistake podcast along those lines. So you start seeing a pattern, like this sounds like, not coincidence, but culture. There's a story, Katie Anderson really, I think, first helped bring this story to light through Asao Yoshino and the book that they did together that Katie wrote, Learning to Lead, Leading to Learn. And Mr. Yoshino told that story in my podcast. And then David Meyer, who was the co-author with Jeff Leiker of the Toyota Way Field book and, one of the other Toyota Way series books. So Mr. Yoshino started his career in the 1960s in Japan. David started at Toyota in the mid to late 80s in Kentucky, and they had a very similar story. Mr. Yoshino's was in a paint shop. David Meyer's story was in like a bumper parts molding machine. Both stories, basically, big, huge quality problems because the wrong chemical had gotten loaded into a machine. And in both situations, the Toyota leaders at those sites recognized this was a systemic problem. We didn't set frontline team up for success. And instead of punishing them, it was more of an apology.
Yeah.
We're sorry that we put you in this position. They learned from it. They made some systemic changes to mistake proof or make it less likely to use the wrong chemical. And I think in both stories, like that wrong chemical wasn't even supposed to be there, and they hadn't anticipated that it might be there. So they hadn't thought to error proof against something that wasn't supposed to happen.
Yeah.
So as much as you focus on good process and preventing mistakes in a complicated workplace, a complicated, ever-changing world, new opportunities for mistakes will appear. And I think the key then is reacting in a way that allows people to learn and grow, because if you take the punitive approach, people are just going to get better at hiding and covering up mistakes. And that's, to think of the title of your podcast, that's probably not the way we get to enterprise excellence, by hiding and covering up mistakes, right?
No, you gotta, like I think you wrote in the book, you've got to basically admit mistakes, see the mistakes, then you can understand the mistakes, and then you can solve the mistakes. I'm thinking, Mark, back to Deming's 14 points, Edwards Deming that had the 14 points where he can't remember which point it is, but one of them was clearly talking about that. Most problems are a leadership or systemic problem, not.
He also said eliminate fear.
Yeah,
as one of the 14 points.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? He was a bit of a legend for his time, which, obviously Toyota and many others took some learnings from him too and built it naturally into their culture.
Yeah.
Mark, what have been the key learnings for you through this book? Like, as you've written it and you've been running the podcast and you've been doing everything that you've been doing for a long time and doing some great stuff. But what's been the recent learnings as you go through this book and you've been able to pull it all together?
Yeah. Well, I think one advantage of writing the book when I did, right? I started the project in March of 2022. I think if I tried writing the book, let's say mid 2021, or even when I started in March 22, if I had made faster progress, I would have lost out on the opportunity. Some of the timing last year as it worked out, in August of 2022, I was able to do some of this formal education through Tim Clark and his organization on psychological safety. And, I had interviewed Amy Edmondson previously and read her book, and those ideas were kind of bouncing around in my head. But I think at that, like with that timing and in the context of thinking about the podcast and mistakes and the book, and I think Clark's work just lends so much clarity to not just what psychological safety is, but how we can cultivate that, in a workplace. So I think, a lot of the lessons that wouldn't have been in the book if I had written it sooner, some of the key takeaways that I tried to pass along are, for example, we wouldn't blame individuals for systemic quality problems. We shouldn't blame people for not speaking up when that's a systemic culture problem. I hear in healthcare sometimes, nurses who are, let's say, in a lower position of professional hierarchy compared to physicians or surgeons. And there's this cultural problem of nurses not speaking up to challenge a surgeon. We shouldn't blame nurses for that cultural dynamic that happens in a lot of different countries. And I've seen sometimes people lecturing the nurses you should speak up. Don't you care about the patients? There's almost this guilt trip, and it's your professional obligation to speak up. And I'm that's to me, that's unfair. That's a little unfair of not telling someone you should be courageous and maybe jeopardize your paycheck. I don't think that's realistic.
Yeah.
So I think the lessons around, leaders having that obligation and that responsibility to create the conditions for psychological safety, and passing along another lesson from Tim Clark. He says you have to avoid rhetorical reassurances of things like, Brad, this is a safe space. You should feel safe speaking up. If that's not your history or your experience, I can't just declare that and make it true.
No.
You might be new to the organization. Let's say you left some other place where you were tired of getting blamed and punished for things that even weren't your fault. It's going to take time. It's like building trust, and through these two key actions of, again, modeling certain behaviors and then rewarding behaviors, people can start to come to believe it is safe. It is generally safe here. We've seen people join KaiNexus, or again, it's not perfect. Toyota's not perfect, but I think, and we've done surveys, it's a generally high-ish perception of psychological safety there, but that doesn't mean everyone feels the exact same level of safety because of their own experiences, their own history, different factors. How new are they to the company? So we try to encourage from day one people to speak up and to challenge the status quo, but you also have to help them feel accepted and included and respected. So there's back to Toyota frameworks of respect for people as a foundation. That's what final point to this. Tim Clark, with his 4 stages of psychological safety. Stage 1 is inclusion safety. Do you feel included, accepted, and respected? Without that, it's hard to ask people to challenge the status quo. That's where we start getting Kaizen and innovation. in stage 4 of his framework. So there's a lot of connections. It's really interesting, I think, to try to crosswalk it to Lean and Toyota principles.
Yeah, it's amazing. So it really sounds, Mark, like these moments of truth when a mistake happens or something doesn't go right, and then what the leadership behaviors are around that are real moments of truth to create psychological safety or to impact psychological safety. And I'm guessing you don't need too many negative experiences for it to have someone, run to a corner and avoid admitting a mistake that comes up or a challenge.
Yeah. I mean, people will protect themselves and even more broadly beyond admitting mistakes. So we have this moment of like, do I say something or not? And you're kind of trying to think through my expected benefit, the potential benefit versus the risk or the potential downside. And if that feels out of balance, it's natural that people will protect themselves and choose to stay quiet. And that can be really costly to the organization.
Yeah.
When people are holding back or, afraid to speak up. And one other quick example, because I think it's another great example of ongoing lean transformation, GE in recent years, with Larry Culp as CEO. He wasn't a podcast guest. I would love that maybe, but I saw him speak at the AME conference in the US in Dallas in November. And he didn't use the exact word psychological safety, but I quoted him in the book because he was talking about coming in as an outsider CEO, realizing he had inherited a culture that loved shooting the messenger. People learned to keep quiet about bad news. And he realized he had to, first off, encourage people, and very actively encourage people. I want to hear bad news faster so we can learn, not so you could turn and punish someone faster. He was encouraging people to speak up. And then he actually used, now the thing about that phrase, then there's the moment of truth. How do you react as a leader? Because you can say all the right things and encourage people to speak up, but then if you punish them even subtly when they do, that's not going to build the culture the lean culture that he's really working to build at GE.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Such a powerful, simple thing, one focus area, but such a powerful path to shift culture.
Yeah.
Mark, what would be your enterprise excellence 2-minute tip in this area for leaders, particularly? I guess we're talking a lot about leadership behavior here and that moment of truth around a mistake. What would be that tip you'd give them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm trying to spread what I've learned, or I wish I'd known 20 years ago, is like for all the focus that we put on, let's say, training people on problem solving, if people don't feel safe bringing forward the problem, that problem solving training might kind of go to waste, or they won't be able to practice it and develop it. So there's two PSs that have to come together: psychological safety and problem solving, and they go hand in hand. So if you have problem solving without psychological safety, there's no problems to work on. And we think of the old Toyota-ism, no problems is a problem, right? We want to make it safe to speak up. But then here's the other thing. If people feel safe to speak up, but then nothing comes of it, without the problem solving, people will stop speaking up. And I credit a professor at the University of Texas, Ethan Burris, who has done research, and this framework is so insightful. The two main reasons people choose to not speak up at work, we think of fear. We have to eliminate the fear factor. Actually, ranking a little bit more highly as the reason why people don't speak up is the futility factor. They say, well, I feel safe to speak up, but nothing happens, so why bother?
Yeah.
So I think we need them both. That's my 2-minute tip. There's been so much emphasis in the lean community, and rightfully so, on problem solving, getting better at problem solving. But I think it really does, and again, we can point to Toyota and other organizations, really has to be built on a framework of psychological safety, which is so interconnected with the idea of respect for people.
Yeah.
But I think talking about that more specifically, I think would be helpful for different organizations. So that's kind of my topic for the lean community. And I'm hoping that the book, it's designed to appeal to audiences beyond the lean community, but maybe introduce people to some of these lean concepts that you and I and your listeners love. Trying to introduce those concepts to people who might not pick up a book about Toyota.
Yeah, it's awesome. Well, Mark, I really appreciate, mate. It sounds an amazing book, great read, and a really enjoyable read, and well worth it on such an important topic. Mark, how can people reach out to you and get hold of the book if they want?
It is. So the book's website is mistakesbook.com. That will have links to, Amazon around the world is probably the easiest, most likely place to buy it. It's starting to become available in some other online bookstores. In the US, especially if people want to order copies directly from me, if they want to order them for their team or do a bulk purchase or a signed copy, they can order those through mistakesbook.com. And then, first off, the small test of change, if people want to download a free preview, they can do that, mistakesbook.com/chapter, or Amazon should have that feature where you can look inside the book and, decide for yourself if it's something you want to read.
That's awesome. Well, Mark, thank you, mate, for everything you have done and continue to do to help us create a better future, mate. Thanks for writing such an amazing book. And I gained so much from it and from this chat. Thanks very much, Mark.
Oh, thank you, Brad. Really appreciate it.
Cheers, mate. Bye for now.
Cheers. Thank you.
What a great episode. Mark has kindly provided us a free chapter location to be able to check out his book before we even consider buying it. To get hold of the chapter of Mark's book, The Mistakes That Make Us, go to his website, www.mistakesbook.com/chapter/. There were two key takeaways for me from this episode. Firstly, the power of leadership behaviour in that moment of a problem being identified and influencing psychological safety so much, either positively or negatively. It is such a real moment of truth. Someone is involved in a mistake or raises a problem with a leader, then they experience the leader's behaviour. They see their body language, hear their tone of voice, and the words they say. This will either say to that person, "This is not a psychologically safe environment, your ideas are not welcome, or you have done wrong, and I'm going to punish you." It could also be, "Hey, thank you, this is great. We need to be raising ideas like this, working together to overcome problems. Thank you so much." It's a real moment of truth, and it can go either way. The second key takeaway for me is, without psychological safety, people won't feel comfortable raising mistakes or challenges. And without people raising mistakes and challenges, there'll be little opportunity to understand them, conduct root cause, and stop them happening again. This is such a powerful statement in itself. Creating a culture of continuous improvement and innovation requires an environment where people at all levels of the organisation are identifying problems, raising ideas to improve, and moving forward towards their goals and vision. If they raise problems, we then need the system in place for them to be able to prioritise problems, conduct root cause, and then execute these in their huddle or escalate them if they can't handle it. It's like a yin and yang system. You need the psychologically safe environment through leadership behaviour and the system to execute and improve moving forward. What a great episode. Thanks so much again for your time and knowledge, Mark. Thanks for everything you're doing to help create a better future. Bye for now.